Chapter 4, Time Out of Mind.
The light's almost ready,
Alexandra said, consulting his pocket watch. The grand staircase loomed before them, its brass fixtures seeming to breathe in the deepening twilight.
3 more minutes until the angle is perfect.
Maya adjusted her tripod, framing the shot carefully. Through her viewfinder, the staircase looked different than it had earlier, more alive somehow, as if the marble steps were waiting for something. Or someone.
These brackets,
Alexandra said, running his fingers along an ornate metal fitting.
were hand-forged by a craftsman who claimed he could speak to metal. Convinced the original owner they would only shine their brightest at specific times.
And did they?
Maya asked, noting how the brass seemed to warm under his touch.
Why don't you tell me?
He stepped back, and Maya could have sworn the metal dulled slightly.
Your third lens option would work best for this. The 50mm, I believe.
How did you know what lenses I brought?
The shape and size of your camera bag. One develops an eye for such details after sufficient experience.
But his smile suggested there was more to it.
Besides, it's what I would have chosen in your place.
You're a photographer too?
She reached for the suggested lens. Curiosity piqued.
I dabbled some time ago.
Something flickered in his expression.
The technology has changed considerably since then.
Maya started to remove her current lens, but her fingers, usually so sure with her equipment, fumbled. The lens slipped from her grasp. She lunged for it, knowing even as she moved that she'd never catch it in time. Alexandra's hand shot out, snatching the lens from mid-air with impossible speed. For a moment he stood frozen, as if realizing he'd moved too quickly to be entirely natural. Then he cleared his throat and offered the lens to Maya with studied casualness.
Good reflexes,
she said softly, accepting the lens. Their fingers brushed during the exchange, and that now familiar fever warmth sent shivers up her arm.
Lucky catch.
He murmured, though they both knew it had been anything but luck.
Though perhaps we should stick to your digital equipment for now. Less risky.
I don't mind a little risk.
Maya held his gaze as she safely stored the unused lens.
In fact, I'm starting to think I rather enjoy it.
A chime echoed through the hotel. Not from any clock Maya could see, but Alexandra straightened at the sound.
Ah, perfect timing. The light's ready.
He was right. The last rays of sunset had found some hidden pathway through the hotel's windows, illuminating the staircase in ways that defied architectural logic. The brass fixtures gleamed like liquid gold, and the marble seemed to glow from within. Maya began shooting, moving around the space with practiced efficiency. Through her viewfinder, she caught glimpses of Alexandra watching her work. He stayed carefully out of frame, but his presence seemed to fill the space anyway, like perfume lingering in an empty room.
Beautiful,
she murmured, checking her preview screen.
Yes.
Alexandra agreed, and something in his voice made her look up. He wasn't watching the staircase anymore. Maya felt heat rise to her cheeks.
The light,
she clarified quickly.
It's exactly what we needed.
Indeed.
His smile suggested he was enjoying her fluster.
Though I suspect these particular shots won't suffer from any mysterious corruptions.
Because you're not in frame?
Maya couldn't resist asking.
Or because the hotel approves of my artistic choices?
Perhaps both.
He moved closer, ostensibly to examine her preview screen. The heat of him radiated against her back, professional proximity made intimate by that impossible warmth.
Though the Monteleone does seem to have taken a particular shine to you.
Is that unusual?
Maya tried to focus on adjusting her settings, not on how natural it felt to have him standing so close.
Very.
His breath stirred her hair as he spoke.
The hotel can be quite selective about who it welcomes, rather like its historical consultant.
Maya turned, finding herself mere inches from him. The dying light caught in his eyes, making them look like aged whiskey held up to flame.
And have I passed the consultant's inspection?
With flying colours.
His voice had dropped lower, almost hypnotic.
Though I should warn you, my approval can be more dangerous than my disapproval.
A distant clock struck 9, the sound echoing strangely through the empty hotel. Alexandra stepped back, that careful composure settling over him again like a familiar coat.
Speaking of danger,
He said, his tone lightening.
I believe I promised you an introduction to some rather unique jazz. Shall we?
Maya began packing her equipment, trying to ignore how her hands still tingled from his proximity.
Lead the way, Mr. Historical Consultant. Though I warn you, my curiosity doesn't end with staircases and mysterious lighting conditions.
I would be disappointed if it did.
He helped her with her camera bag, his movements courtly yet somehow intimate.
Though perhaps we should establish some ground rules about questions and answers.
Let me guess.
Maya said as they headed for the entrance.
3 questions per night, and you have to answer truthfully, but can choose to pass on one?
Alexandra's laugh echoed through the lobby.
You've been reading too many fairy tales.
Says the man who probably inspired half of them.
His step faltered almost imperceptibly.
Careful, Miss Richardson. Some stories are better left in their original editions.
They emerged into the French Quarter night, the streets alive with music and possibility. Alexandra offered his arm with old-world grace, and Maya took it, noting how his fever warmth seemed to ward off the evening chill.
Now then,
He said, guiding her through the crowds with practiced ease.
let me introduce you to a place that makes the Monteleone seem positively mundane.
La Maison Violet turned out to be hidden behind an unmarked purple door in a courtyard off Bourbon Street. The only indication they'd found the right place was a brass musical note embedded in the cobblestones, worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. Alexandra's knock produced no obvious response, but moments later the door swung open on silent hinges. Maya had expected something speakeasy style, all artificial vintage and Instagram-ready decor. Instead, she stepped into what felt like a perfectly preserved slice of 1920s New Orleans. The lighting came from actual gas lamps, their flames casting warm pools of light across intimate tables. The stage held a piano that had clearly never heard of electronic keyboards, and the bar's mirror bore the kind of authentic age spots that no amount of artificial distressing could replicate.
This can't be real.
She murmured, professional instincts already cataloguing the improbable authenticity of every detail.
That rather depends on your definition of real.
Alexandra said, guiding her to a table with a perfect view of both the stage and the dance floor. The chair he held for her felt solid enough, its velvet cushion worn in ways that spoke of genuine history rather than artificial aging. A woman in a beaded dress that might have been vintage, or might have been modern, Maya found she couldn't quite tell, approached their table.
The usual, Mr. St. Martin?
Please, Evangeline, and perhaps the house special for my guest.
He glanced at Maya.
Unless you'd prefer something more conventional.
Maya thought about the coffee from earlier, how it had tasted like midnight gardens and forgotten spices.
I trust your judgment.
Evangeline's smile held secrets.
Wise choice, Cher. Some things are better experienced than explained.
As she glided away, Maya noticed how her beaded dress caught the gaslight, creating patterns that seemed to move independently of the fabric.
Let me guess.
She said, leaning closer to Alexandra across the table.
She's been working here since the place opened?
His answering smile carried traces of approval.
Not quite, but her grandmother did.
Before Maya could pursue that line of questioning, the band took the stage. The piano player's fingers moved across the keys like water over stones, drawing forth melodies that seemed to exist somewhere between memory and dream. The singer, when she began, had a voice that made Maya think of smoke and honey and things whispered in the dark.
I know this song,
she said, though she was quite sure she'd never heard it before.
Do you?
Alexandra watched her with that intense focus she was beginning to crave.
It hasn't been performed in quite some time.
Maya closed her eyes, letting the music wash over her.
It feels like looking at an old photograph. You know the one I mean? Where you can't quite make out all the details, but you know exactly how it makes you feel.
When she opened her eyes, Alexandra was still watching her, but something had shifted in his expression. For a moment, he looked almost pained, as if her words had touched something tender and uncertain. Evangeline returned with their drinks, something amber and gleaming for Alexandra, and for Maya a glass that seemed to contain liquid moonlight. Actual moonlight, she would have sworn, captured and distilled into something that smelled like jasmine and possibility.
To unconventional perspectives,
Alexandra said, raising his glass.
To seeing what others miss.
The drink tasted like summer nights in secret gardens, like every romantic moment she'd ever captured through her lens distilled into liquid form. She felt it spread warmth through her body, making the gas lamp's light softer, the music richer, the space between her and Alexandra both larger and more intimate.
You're doing it again,
She accused, but couldn't keep the smile from her voice.
doing what?
His innocence would have been more convincing if his eyes weren't dancing with barely suppressed mischief.
That thing where you introduce me to impossible experiences that somehow feel more real than reality.
She took another sip, watching him over the rim of her glass.
First the coffee, now this. I'm starting to think you're trying to spoil me for ordinary pleasures.
Something flickered in his expression. Desire, concern, before his smile smoothed it away.
Perhaps I simply want to show you that reality has more layers than most people suspect. A photographer, of all people, should appreciate that.
Layers.
Maya repeated thoughtfully.
Like how this place seems to exist in multiple times at once.
She gestured to where the singer was performing what sounded like a jazz arrangement of a medieval troubadour's song.
Or like how you seem to know everyone here. Yet I've never heard of this place despite photographing half the French Quarter.
You ask dangerous questions, Ms. Richardson.
But his tone was warm, almost proud.
Maya.
She corrected automatically.
And you give dangerous answers, Mr. St. Martin. All hints and implications, like a photograph that's deliberately out of focus.
His laugh surprised them both, rich and genuine in a way that made several heads turn. Though Maya noticed none of the other patrons seemed surprised to see him there.
I begin to think the Monteleone knew exactly what it was doing when it requested you specifically.
The Monteleone requested...
Maya started to ask, but at that moment the band shifted into something slower, more intimate. The kind of song that existed specifically for the space between two people.
Dance with me?
Maya looked at his extended hand, remembering that fever warmth from earlier.
I should warn you, I'm better at capturing graceful moments than creating them.
Trust me.
The way he said it felt like more than an invitation to dance. She placed her hand in his, letting him draw her to her feet. That now familiar heat spread up her arm, but this time it felt less like fever and more like coming in from the cold. He led her to the dance floor with the kind of confidence that made her own uncertainty irrelevant.
The trick
He said, drawing her closer than strictly necessary for the tempo.
is to stop thinking about the steps and simply feel the music.
Is that your professional opinion as a historical consultant?
Maya asked, hyper-aware of his hand at her waist, the other clasping hers as if it belonged there.
No,
He murmured, close enough that she could feel his smile.
that's several centuries of empirical observation.
He said it so naturally, with such perfect timing, that Maya found herself laughing even as she registered the impossibility of his words.
Several centuries? You don't look a day over 200.
Something shifted in his hold, a moment of tension quickly masked.
The light in here is very flattering.
Maya agreed, letting him spin her under the gas lamps.
Almost like it was designed specifically to hide certain things while highlighting others. Like a photographer, choosing exactly what to reveal in each frame.
His steps faltered slightly, so briefly she might have imagined it.
You're entirely too observant for your own good.
Says the man who noticed I brought my grandmother's Rolleiflex without me even opening my bag.
She let him pull her back from the spin, ending slightly closer than they'd started.
We all have our secrets, Alexandra. The question is whether we're going to keep dancing around them or start developing the negatives.
His hand tightened fractionally at her waist.
Some negatives are better left unexposed.
Says who?
Maya challenged softly.
The photographer or the subject?
Before Alexandra could answer, the song transformed into something with a faster rhythm, all primal drums and wailing saxophone. The change demanded a different kind of dance, closer, more intimate, despite the quicker tempo. Alexandra's hand slid from her waist to the small of her back, drawing her against him as they moved to the music's demanding pulse. Each step, each turn, each roll of their bodies felt like a conversation too intimate for words. Maya let him lead her through the complicated footwork, their bodies moving in perfect synchronization, as if they'd danced together for centuries. The heat between them built with each measure, every shift and sway charged with unspoken possibility. When he spun her out and pulled her back, she ended even closer than before, their faces inches apart, breath mingling in the space between heartbeats. The music drove them faster, harder, the rhythm echoing the racing of Maya's pulse. She could feel the barely restrained power in his movements, the careful control in each turn, each dip, each moment his hands guided her body through the dance. It was seduction set to music, desire transformed into motion, and Maya found herself wondering if this was how it felt to surrender to something both dangerous and inevitable. Just as the tension became almost unbearable, the song ended with a crash of cymbals. They stood frozen for a moment, still wrapped around each other, hearts pounding in time. Then Alexandra stepped back, creating a small but noticeable distance between them. Maya found herself missing his warmth immediately, even as she recognized the timing of the interruption felt almost deliberate.
Another drink?
Alexandra suggested, leading her back to their table.
Or perhaps some air. The courtyard here is particularly lovely at night.
Air,
Maya decided, noting how he'd smoothly redirected their conversation.
Though I have to warn you, my questions don't disappear just because you change the scenery.
His lips twitched.
I would be disappointed if they did.
The courtyard turned out to be a small miracle of architectural preservation, its wrought iron balconies and gas lamps creating the perfect stage set for secrets. A fountain played in one corner, its water black as ink in the darkness, but somehow still catching starlight in every ripple.
Let me guess.
Maya said, settling onto an aged stone bench that felt impossibly comfortable.
The fountain's been running continuously since 1857, and the original owner made some kind of deal with a water spirit to keep it flowing.
Alexandra actually stumbled, something she hadn't thought him capable of.
What makes you say that?
Because that's the kind of place this is.
She patted the bench beside her.
The kind where impossible things happen so naturally that people either don't notice them or pretend not to. Like a certain historical consultant who never appears in digital photographs.
He sat beside her, leaving careful space between them.
You've been reviewing your shots from the meeting.
Trying to,
Maya corrected.
though somehow every frame you should have been in turned out corrupted. Quite the technological coincidence.
Old buildings can play havoc with modern equipment.
But he wasn't meeting her eyes, focusing instead on the fountain.
And I suppose the fact that you cast no reflection in the bar mirror was just a trick of those antique gas lamps?
Now he did look at her, surprise briefly overwhelming his careful composure.
You noticed that?
I notice everything, Alexandra. It's literally my job.
Maya turned to face him fully.
Just like I notice how you know details about my cameras that would be impossible to spot. The exact focal length of lenses still in my bag. The manufacturing date of my grandmother's Rolleiflex down to the month. How you move like someone who learned formal dance steps when they were actually formal, and how every single person in that club treats you with the kind of deference usually reserved for
His voice had gone very quiet.
for someone who's been a regular since before they were born.
The fountain's music filled the silence between them. Finally, Alexandra spoke.
Most people, when they notice such things, either refuse to believe their own observations or run away screaming.
Yes, well,
Maya smiled.
we've already established I'm not most people.
No,
He agreed softly.
you're quite extraordinarily not.
He shifted on the bench, and somehow the careful space between them had disappeared.
Which makes this all the more
Dangerous?
She suggested when he trailed off.
complicated.
Maya laughed.
More complicated than a haunted hotel that art directs its own renovation photos? then a jazz club that exists outside of normal time, then a historical consultant who...
He pressed a finger to her lips, the gesture so swift she didn't see him move.
Some things, once named, cannot be unnamed.
The fever warmth of his touch sent shivers down her spine that had nothing to do with fear.
Is that why you won't say it? Because you think naming it makes it real?
No,
His finger traced the curve of her lower lip before withdrawing.
because naming it makes it final, makes this
He gestured between them.
impossible to pretend away.
Bold of you to assume I want to pretend it away.
Before he could withdraw his finger from her lips, Maya caught his hand, the movement more instinct than decision. For a heartbeat, they both froze, her fingers wrapped around his wrist, his skin burning against hers. Then, slowly, deliberately, Alexandra turned his hand in her grasp and laced their fingers together, transforming her impulsive grab into an intimate connection.
Maybe I like impossible things.
She whispered, suddenly breathless.
Maybe I've spent my whole career capturing beautiful moments precisely because I know they can't last forever.
Something like pain flickered across his features.
And if those moments could last forever, if the beauty you captured never faded, never changed, never moved forward.
You make immortality sound like such a burden.
The words slipped out before she could stop them. Alexandra went very still. In the fountain's song, Maya could have sworn she heard warning bells, but his hand remained in hers, that impossible warmth anchoring her to the moment.
You really aren't afraid.
He said wonderingly.
Oh, I'm terrified.
Maya squeezed his fingers.
But not of what you are. I'm terrified of all the normal things. Of not being good enough, of missing the perfect shot, of letting an important moment slip away uncaptured.
She paused, gathering her courage.
Of feeling something real and letting fear of its strangeness stop me from exploring it.
He made a sound that might have been a laugh, or might have been pain.
You don't know what you're asking for.
I'm not asking for anything.
Maya corrected gently.
I'm just refusing to look away from what's right in front of me. Professional habit, you might say.
The fountain song changed subtly, its rhythm picking up like a heartbeat. Alexandra lifted their joined hands, studying how their fingers intertwined.
Did you know,
He said conversationally,
that in the early days of photography, people believed cameras could capture souls?
Like the original owner of the Monteleone and his furniture portraits?
Exactly.
His thumb traced patterns on her wrist, each touch sending sparks through her nervous system.
They weren't entirely wrong. A photograph can capture something of a person's essence, a moment of their truth. But some truths are too dangerous to be captured.
Says the man who doesn't show up in digital photos.
Maya shifted closer, drawn by the heat radiating from his skin.
Have you considered that maybe some truths want to be seen? That maybe they're tired of hiding in the shadows, waiting for someone with the right kind of lens to finally bring them into focus?
Maya,
The way Alexandra said her name felt like a prayer and a warning wrapped into one.
you have no idea how long I've waited for someone who sees the world the way you do, who looks at shadows and finds light, who sees strangeness and finds beauty.
His free hand came up to cup her cheek, and Maya leaned into the warmth instinctively.
That's precisely why I have to.
A clock somewhere struck midnight, its chimes echoing through the courtyard like silver bullets. Alexandra withdrew his hand as if burned, though Maya knew impossible heat was his natural state.
We should get back inside.
He said, his voice carefully controlled again.
You have an early morning shoot tomorrow, if I remember the schedule correctly.
The schedule you created.
Maya pointed out, not moving.
Tell me something, Alexandra. Did you arrange all those sunset and midnight sessions because the light is actually better then? Or because those are the times you can most easily be present?
He stood, offering his hand with that old-world grace that now felt like both a revelation and a shield.
Perhaps both can be true at once. The best deceptions, after all, are built on foundations of truth.
Is that what this is?
Maya let him help her up but didn't release his hand.
A deception?
No,
His answer came too quickly to be anything but honest.
that's what makes it so dangerous.
They stood there in the starlight, hands joined, truth hovering between them like a photograph waiting to be developed. The fountain played its midnight song, and somewhere in the club behind them, a saxophone wailed a tune that might have been a century old, or might have been written yesterday.
You know what I think?
Maya said finally.
I think you're used to people either not seeing you at all or seeing only what they expect to see. The mysterious consultant, the elegant stranger, the keeper of historical secrets. But you're not used to someone seeing you and still wanting to stay.
Alexandra's carefully maintained composure cracked just for a moment. In that instant, Maya saw something ancient and lonely and achingly human in his eyes. Then he blinked, and his usual mask slipped back into place.
What makes you so certain of what you're seeing?
Alexandra's voice was gentle, almost sad.
Pictures can lie, Maya. Even the ones we take with our own eyes.
But that's exactly it.
She tightened her grip on his hand.
I don't just see you, I see the gaps where you should be. The missing reflections, the corrupted files, the impossible knowledge. Sometimes the clearest image is the one formed by negative space.
He lifted their joined hands, pressing his lips to her knuckles in a gesture that belonged to another century.
You're playing with fire, ma chérie.
Good thing I'm not afraid of getting burned.
The fountain song changed again, this time to something that sounded like a lullaby mixed with a warning. Alexandra straightened, his expression shifting.
It's getting late. I should see you home.
Maya started to tell him she could manage, but the words died in her throat as he guided her through the French Quarter's back streets with unnervingly perfect confidence. Each turn seemed precisely calculated to avoid the noisiest crowds while staying in well-lit areas. When they reached her temporary apartment, a walk-up she was certain she'd never mentioned, he didn't even hesitate at the entrance.
Let me guess.
She said, pausing at the building's door.
You've memorized the renovation records of every building in the quarter?
Among other things.
His smile held secrets, but his eyes were watching the shadows around them with ancient wariness.
Though I must admit this one's history is particularly fascinating. Did you know it was originally built by a family of...
He stopped himself.
But that's a story for another time.
You know exactly which apartment is mine, don't you?
Second floor, west side, overlooking the courtyard.
He had the grace to look slightly abashed.
The Monteleone's records are quite thorough about where their photographers stay.
The Monteleone's records.
She raised an eyebrow.
From 2024?
Ah.
His expression turned playful despite the tension she could feel humming through him.
Would you believe me if I said I have excellent contacts in the real estate market?
I'm starting to think there's very little about you I wouldn't believe.
She took a step closer, noting how he simultaneously leaned toward and away from her, like a flame caught in contrary winds.
That,
He said softly.
is precisely what worries me.
Before she could respond, he caught her hand again, his fever warmth spreading up her arm like mulled wine on a cold night.
Thank you for the dance, Maya Richardson. And for
He paused, seeming to taste his words before speaking them.
seeing without flinching.
Will I see you tomorrow?
She tried to keep her voice casual, professional.
For the East Wing shoot?
The schedule calls for sunset.
His thumb traced patterns on her palm that felt like ancient script.
Though perhaps we should stick to the better lit areas. Darker corners can be unpredictable.
Says the man who just guided me through every back alley in the quarter without missing a step.
His laugh surprised them both, rich and genuine in the quiet street.
Touche. But some dangers are worth risking. Others...
He lifted her hand, pressing another of those courtly kisses to her palm.
Others require more careful consideration.
Maya felt the kiss like a brand, even after he lowered her hand.
You know, for someone so concerned about danger, you're doing a remarkably poor job of being unappealing.
More's the pity.
He stepped back, and the night air seemed to rush into the space between them.
Sleep well, Maya. Dream of normal things if you can.
Too late for that, I think.
She fumbled for her keys, unwilling to look away first.
You've rather ruined me for normal.
No,
He said so quietly she almost missed it.
you were never meant for normal. That's what makes this so...
He trailed off, shadow and streetlight playing across his features in ways that defied physics.
Complicated?
She suggested.
inevitable.
He turned and walked away before she could process that, his movements too graceful to be entirely human. Maya watched until he disappeared around a corner, the night somehow darker in his wake. Only then did she realize he'd slipped something into her palm during that last kiss. A key that looked centuries old, its brass warm to the touch, as if it had absorbed some of his impossible heat. A label hung from it by a silk ribbon, the handwriting elegant and somehow familiar. For when you're ready to develop those negatives. Maya climbed the stairs to her apartment, the key burning in her hand like a promise. Or a warning. Perhaps she was beginning to understand. They were the same thing. Chapter 5. Overexposed. In her dreams, Maya was back in the Monteleone's grand staircase, but the marble steps seemed to flow like liquid moonlight beneath her feet. She held her grandmother's Rolleiflex, its twin lenses catching impossible reflections as she moved through the space. The viewfinder showed her things that couldn't exist, doorways that opened onto different centuries, shadows that danced like lovers across the walls, light that sang as it spilled through ancient windows. Alexandra's presence surrounded her like perfume, though she couldn't see him. His fever warmth seemed to radiate from the very walls, making the air thick with unspoken promises. When his hands finally found her waist, they burned through her dress like brands, but the heat was a blessing rather than pain.
The camera?
He murmured against her neck, his voice somehow everywhere at once.
You won't need it to capture this moment.
The Rolleiflex dissolved like smoke between her fingers. Maya turned in his arms, finding herself pressed against him as music welled up from somewhere deep in the hotel's foundations. They moved together like they had in La Maison Violet, but here there was no space between them, no careful distance maintained. His hands traced patterns on her skin that felt like ancient spells, each touch igniting something that was equal parts desire and recognition, as if her body had been waiting centuries to remember this dance.
You're not supposed to be real.
She whispered against his mouth, though they weren't quite kissing.
You're too perfect to be real.
Says the woman who sees beauty in shadows.
His lips brushed her temple, her cheekbone, the corner of her mouth, everywhere except where she truly wanted them.
Who finds truth in the spaces between moments.
They were spinning now, or maybe the hotel was spinning around them. Maya couldn't tell where the stairs ended and the sky began. Alexandra's touch remained her only constant, his impossible warmth anchoring her as reality blurred into fantasy.
Stay.
She found herself pleading, though she hadn't meant to speak.
Just stay.
His hands cupped her face, tilting it up until she met his eyes. They held entire universes of longing, of possibility, of things that could never be.
Ma chérie,
He breathed.
I've been waiting for you since before you were born.
When his lips finally found hers, it felt like stepping into one of her photographs, like somehow becoming both the observer and the moment itself, captured forever in perfect light. Maya woke to find her apartment filled with roses, not the standard dozen from a florist, but wild specimens in deep burgundy that looked like they'd been cultivated centuries ago, their scent heavy with history and impossible promises. They spilled across her kitchen counter in an antique silver vase she definitely hadn't owned yesterday. The key he'd given her last night lay beside the vase, no longer warm, but somehow still holding an echo of his touch. A note accompanied it, written in that same elegant hand.
My deepest apologies, but I must postpone today's session. Urgent matters require my attention. The Monteleone's renovation team will provide access to the East Wing, though I recommend avoiding the third floor until I return. Yes.
Maya read the note twice, something cold settling in her stomach, despite the morning sun streaming through her windows. Professional disappointment, she told herself. Nothing more. Certainly not the familiar ache of someone pulling away the morning after sharing too much. She reached for her phone, thinking to email the development team about rescheduling, only to find a message from them already waiting.
Schedule adjustment. East Wing documentation delayed due to unexpected structural concerns. Mr. St. Martin to assess historic preservation requirements before proceeding. New timeline TBD.
Structural concerns.
Maya muttered, running her finger along the key's intricate teeth.
Is that what we're calling it?
Her phone buzzed again, her mother's name lighting up the screen. Maya had completely forgotten their weekly call, too caught up in whatever last night had been.
Sweetheart.
Sarah Richardson's voice carried its usual warmth, but with an undercurrent of concern.
I've been trying to reach you since yesterday. Is everything all right?
Sorry, Mom. I was working late.
Not technically a lie.
The renovation project is keeping me busy.
Her mother's tone suggested she heard what Maya wasn't saying.
And how's that going? Made any interesting discoveries?
Maya's eyes drifted to the roses, their colour an exact match for Alexandra's shirt from last night.
It's complicated.
Complicated how? The architecture or the architect?
Historical consultant, actually.
Maya corrected automatically, then winced as her mother's delighted laugh carried through the speaker.
Ah, so there is someone. Tell me everything. Is he nice? Professional? Please tell me he's not another workaholic like...
Mom,
Maya cut her off before Jason's name could enter the conversation.
it's not like that. We just work well together.
Work well together?
Her mother repeated skeptically.
Is that why you sound like you're smiling for the first time in months?
Maya touched her lips, surprised to find she was indeed smiling despite the disappointment of Alexandra's note.
It's just an interesting project. The hotel has a lot of unusual features.
Like this consultant?
You have no idea.
Maya muttered.
What was that?
Nothing.
Maya picked up the key, its weight somehow reassuring.
Actually, we're having some delays with the project. They found structural issues in the East Wing that need to be assessed before we can continue the documentation.
Structural issues?
Her mother's tone turned knowing.
Or matters of the heart?
Maya thought about the way Alexandra had looked at her in the courtyard, like something precious and dangerous all at once.
Would you believe me if I said both?
After ending the call, Maya found herself drawn to her camera bag. The memory card from last night's staircase shoot was still inside, and she was suddenly desperate to see how the photos had turned out. To prove to herself that something real had happened, even if Alexandra was now pulling away. Her laptop hummed to life, card reader importing the images with familiar efficiency. The staircase shots were perfect, every angle capturing that impossible golden light exactly as she remembered it. But then she reached the last few frames, the ones she hadn't meant to take. Her breath caught. Somehow, impossibly, Alexandra appeared in these photos. Not clearly. His figure was more suggestion than substance, a play of light and shadow that formed his silhouette as he'd stood behind her. In one frame, she could almost make out his expression as he'd watched her work, something raw and wanting in the curve of his mouth. The rose's scent seemed to intensify as she stared at the images, their sweetness taking on a darker note. Maya found herself reaching for her grandmother's Rolleiflex, drawn to its mechanical certainty in the face of impossible things. The key Alexandra had given her caught the morning light, throwing patterns on her wall that looked like old French script. Maya studied them, remembering his words from last night. Some dangers are worth risking, others require more careful consideration. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number.
The roses are from a variety cultivated at Versailles in 1789. They shouldn't exist anymore, much like certain other things that persist beyond their time. Please be careful with that key. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. A.
Maya set her phone down with shaking fingers. The rose's scent had definitely changed, becoming something wild and ancient that made her think of moonlit gardens and forbidden knowledge. She crossed to the vase, meaning to move it somewhere less overwhelming. The moment her fingers touched the silver, every rose in the arrangement turned to ash, crumbling away like centuries catching up in an instant. Only one bloom remained intact, the deepest red of all, its petals now traced with veins of gold that seemed to pulse in time with her heartbeat. Her phone buzzed again.
I'm sorry. Some things are better admired from a safe distance. A-A-Y-Y.
Maya stared at the message for a long moment, anger slowly replacing her initial shock. She'd spent 2 years rebuilding herself after Jason had chosen his career over their relationship, carefully constructing walls around her heart. Then Alexandra had waltzed in with his impossible grace and fever-warm touch, making her feel things she'd sworn never to risk again. And now he was pulling away, trying to protect her. From what? His own feelings. The supernatural world he so clearly inhabited. Her own willing participation in whatever this was becoming. The remaining rose caught the sunlight, its golden veins flaring like synapses firing. Maya picked it up carefully, noting how it warmed to her touch, just like Alexandra's skin had. Two could play at this game. She pulled out her phone and composed a reply.
Some things are worth the risk of getting burned. But if you're determined to maintain a safe distance, I'll be photographing the 3rd floor at midnight. You know, the one you specifically warned me to avoid? MPS. Next time you want to send a message, try using words instead of destructing flora. Some of us prefer direct communication to dramatic gestures.
Her finger hovered over the send button. This was probably a terrible idea, exactly the kind of impulsive decision she'd sworn off after Jason. But then she remembered Alexandra's words from last night. You were never meant for normal. She pressed send. The remaining rose's golden veins pulsed brighter, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across a cloudless sky. Maya spent the morning doing what she always did when emotions threatened to overwhelm her. She cleaned her equipment. Each lens got special attention, each sensor carefully checked for dust. The methodical routine usually centered her, but today her thoughts kept drifting to the way Alexandra had handled her grandmother's Rolleiflex, his fingers moving across its vintage mechanisms with familiar reverence. She'd received no response to her defiant text. The golden-veined rose sat in solitary splendor on her windowsill, catching light in ways that shouldn't be possible. Every time she glanced at it, she could have sworn its pattern had shifted slightly, like a message being constantly rewritten. Her phone rang. Jen, probably wondering about the schedule change.
Please tell me you're not calling to cancel the whole project.
Maya answered, only half joking.
What? No, nothing like that.
Jen's voice carried its usual energy.
Actually, I'm calling because the clients are thrilled with your preliminary shots. They want to know if you consider extending the contract through the grand opening.
Maya's eyes drifted to the rose.
Did this request come through the development team, or...
The historical consultant, actually. Mr. St. Martin specifically mentioned your unique perspective on the property's character.
Of course he had. Maya rubbed her temples.
When would they need an answer?
End of the week. Though between you and me, they seem pretty confident you'll say yes. They're already talking about featuring your work in their historical preservation journal.
Their what?
Some fancy European publication about historical architecture. Very exclusive, apparently. Mr. St. Martin's on the editorial board.
Maya found herself laughing despite everything.
Of course he is.
After ending the call, she forced herself to focus on practical matters. If she was really going to photograph the 3rd floor at midnight, and she was, if only to prove a point, she needed to prepare properly. She spent the afternoon researching the hotel's history, particularly anything about that specific floor. The information she found was odd. Multiple renovation attempts over the centuries, all abandoned for various vague reasons. Reports of strange lights, unexplained sounds. A series of owners who all seemed to die under mysterious circumstances, followed by lengthy periods where ownership records simply disappeared. And through it all, subtle references to consultants and caretakers with suspiciously familiar descriptions. Maya started a timeline, noting how often variations of A. St. Martin appeared in the records, always in connection with preservation efforts or mysterious structural issues. At 4 o'clock, she forced herself to eat something, though food held little appeal. Her normal routine felt hollow somehow, as if the events of the past few days had shifted her perception of reality just enough to make everything else seem slightly wrong. She found herself reaching for her phone several times, composing and deleting messages to Alexandra. What would she even say? Sorry, I threatened to deliberately ignore your warning. Sorry, I'm not sorry. Sorry, I can't stop thinking about the way you almost kissed me in my dreams. Instead, she channeled her restlessness into preparations. She packed both digital and film cameras, including the Rolleiflex, extra batteries, backup memory cards, her most light-sensitive lenses, a small first aid kit, because she wasn't completely reckless, her grandmother's old rosary, found in the bottom of her camera bag where it had been tucked away for luck on her first professional shoot. The golden rose caught the setting sun, its veins flaring like warning signals. Maya carefully wrapped it in tissue paper and added it to her bag. Something told her she might need it. As twilight approached, she walked down to the French Quarter's oldest camera shop, the same one that had supplied her with film for the Rolleiflex. The elderly owner looked up as she entered, his eyes crinkling with recognition.
Back so soon, Cherie. Let me guess. You need something special for night shooting.
Maya blinked.
How did you...
The Monteleone has its own requirements.
He disappeared into his back room, returning with a small wooden box.
These were made specially, many years ago. Silver halide emulsion, very sensitive to certain types of light.
I didn't ask for...
No charge.
He pressed the box into her hands.
Consider it a welcome gift from those of us who appreciate photographers, who see what others miss.
The film rolls inside the box felt warm to the touch, like they'd been sitting in sunlight despite the shop's dim interior. Maya started to ask more questions, but something in the old man's smile stopped her. Some answers she was learning were better discovered than explained. She spent the remaining hours before midnight walking the quarter, camera in hand but rarely raising it to shoot. Everything looked different now, more layered, more alive with possibility. She caught glimpses of things she would have dismissed days ago, shadows that moved against the flow of light, windows that showed different scenes depending on the angle, people whose clothing and manners belonged to other centuries. Or maybe she was just learning to see what had always been there, hidden in plain sight, like Alexandra's missing reflections. At 11:30, she turned toward the Monteleone. The hotel's silhouette stood dark against the night sky, its wrought iron balconies creating patterns that seemed to shift when viewed directly. No lights showed in any of the windows, but somehow the building didn't feel empty. It felt expectant. Waiting. Maya touched the key in her pocket, its brass warm against her fingers. According to the historical documents she'd found, the third floor had originally contained private apartments for the hotel's owner and his special guests. The records were vague about why those apartments had been abandoned, but they all mentioned the same detail. The rooms had been sealed on a moonless night in 1801. The quarter's bells began to toll midnight as Maya reached the hotel's side entrance. She drew out the key, noting how it caught the streetlight like it was made of gold rather than brass. The lock clicked open at her touch, the door swinging inward on silent hinges. Darkness waited beyond the threshold, thick and alive with possibilities. Maya adjusted her camera strap, checked her flashlight, and took a deep breath.
All right, Alexandra,
She murmured.
let's see what you're really trying to protect me from.
She stepped into the Monteleone's shadows, the door closing behind her with the soft finality of a shutter release. The Monteleone's third floor felt different from the rest of the hotel. The air hung heavier here, thick with secrets and something that might have been embarrassment. Maya's flashlight beam seemed reluctant to penetrate the darkness, as if the shadows themselves were shy about being seen. Each step on the creaking floorboards produced a sound almost like a whisper, not of warning, but of mortification. When Maya tried the first door, it stayed firmly shut, despite the key that had worked perfectly on the entrance. She could have sworn she felt the building holding its breath.
It's all right.
She found herself saying to the empty corridor.
I'm not here to judge. I just want to understand.
A draft stirred her hair, the gentlest of touches, like a hesitant pat. The next door opened at her touch, just a crack, like a debutante offering the briefest glimpse behind her fan. The room beyond stopped Maya in her tracks. Unlike the construction chaos below, this space remained perfectly preserved, though not from any era she recognized. Styles from different centuries mingled seamlessly. Renaissance furniture draped with Art Deco fabrics, Victorian gadgets sharing space with what looked like much older scientific instruments. The whole room felt like a teenager's hidden sanctuary, where treasured objects from different phases of growing up had been carefully hoarded away. Maya lifted her camera, but the first click of the shutter made the walls actually shiver. The curtains drew themselves tighter, and she distinctly felt the hotel's mortification.
I'm sorry,
She said quickly.
I should have asked first. Would it be all right if...
She doesn't like being seen like this.
Maya spun toward Alexandra's voice, her heart leaping despite everything. He stood in the doorway, dressed entirely in black, his usual elegance somehow more dangerous in the darkness.
The hotel?
Maya asked, though she already knew.
She's quite sensitive about the third floor. It's where she keeps her memories, her experiments with different identities over the centuries.
His voice held genuine affection.
Rather like a young girl's diary, filled with phases and feelings she'd rather forget.
That's why you wanted to delay the photography.
Maya lowered her camera.
Not because of any danger to me, but because the hotel wasn't ready.
Partially.
Alexandra remained in the doorway, maintaining that careful distance he'd established with his note.
Though the danger is also very real.
What danger?
Maya challenged.
The only thing I've felt up here is embarrassment. The hotel's more worried about me judging her decorating choices than causing any harm.
A crystal decanter on a nearby table rattled in agreement, then quickly stilled as if shocked by its own admission. Alexandra's lips twitched despite his serious expression.
The hotel may have grown fond of you,
He admitted.
but that doesn't change what I am. What being around me could do to you.
Funny.
Maya took a step toward him.
You didn't seem so concerned about that last night.
Last night was a mistake.
The only mistake
Maya said quietly.
was sending me roses just to turn them to ash. If you wanted to push me away, you could have simply said so. I'm a big girl, Alexandra. I can handle rejection without supernatural theatrics.
He made a sound of frustration.
You think this is about rejection? Maya, I could kill you with a touch. One moment of lost control, one slip of this cursed strength.
The roses didn't die when I touched them.
She interrupted.
Well, all except one, and that one.
She reached into her bag, drawing out the golden-veined flower.
This one changed instead. Adapted, evolved.
That's different. The roses were already dead. You're...
Alive, mortal, breakable,
Maya took another step forward.
capable of making my own choices about what risks are worth taking.
The hotel's atmosphere had changed, its earlier embarrassment giving way to something like breathless anticipation. The curtains drew back slightly, moonlight spilling across the floor between them like a spotlight.
You don't understand what you're asking for.
Alexandre said, but he didn't step back when she moved closer.
Then help me understand. Show me the truth you're so afraid of. Because right now, all I see is a man using his nature as an excuse to run from something real.
A man?
His laugh held no humor.
Is that what you think I am?
I think
Maya said carefully.
you're someone who spent so long playing different roles, consultant, caretaker, mysterious benefactor, that you've forgotten how to simply be whoever you are underneath it all. Rather like this floor, full of collected identities, but hiding its true self.
The hotel's presence rippled around them, a wave of surprised recognition. A mirror on the far wall shifted slightly, angling to catch Alexandra's non-existent reflection.
The hotel's not the only one who needs to learn. It's okay to be seen.
Maya added softly. Alexandra moved then, too fast for human eyes to track. One moment he stood in the doorway, the next he had Maya pressed against the wall, his body caging her without actually touching.
You want to see?
His voice was almost a growl.
Look then, look closely.
His eyes had changed, becoming something ancient and hungry. When he spoke, she caught glimpses of fangs that definitely hadn't been there before. The temperature around them plummeted, frost crystallizing on the windows despite the summer night outside. But his hands, braced on either side of her head, still radiated that impossible fever warmth. And in his expression, beneath the deliberate display of monstrosity, Maya saw something that broke her heart a little. Fear. Not of hurting her, she realized, but of her reaction, of her finally seeing and running away. So Maya did the only thing she could think of. She reached up and touched his face, fingers tracing the sharp edge of his cheekbone exactly as she'd done in her dream.
I see you?
She whispered.
I've always seen you.
Alexandra shuddered, his entire body going rigid. For a moment, Maya thought he might actually kiss her. Then the shutters slammed closed with enough force to shake the walls, plunging them into darkness. When her flashlight flickered back on, she was alone in the room. Only the lingering heat of his presence against her palm suggested he'd been there at all. A breath of air, warm this time, apologetic, stirred her hair. The hotel's presence wrapped around her like a consoling hug.
It's all right.
Maya told the empty room, her voice only shaking slightly.
I understand about fears and phases, and not being ready to be seen. Take all the time you need with the photography. Both of you.
She made her way back downstairs, the hotel's lights guiding her path with gentle courtesy. In the lobby, she found a note written in familiar, elegant script.
The hotel apologizes for its reticence. It's not used to sharing certain aspects of itself, even with those it trusts. Rather like some other entities, you know. I apologize as well. For the roses, for tonight, for not being what you deserve. Please don't come looking for me again. Some photographs are better left undeveloped.
Maya read the note twice, then carefully tucked it into her bag alongside the golden-veined rose. Outside, the quarter's bells began to toll 1 o'clock, the sound carrying both warning and promise on the heavy air.
We'll see about that,
she murmured, and could have sworn she felt the hotel's quiet approval in the way the door closed behind her, not with finality this time, but with the gentle click of a pause between moments. Some stories, after all, were too important to leave unfinished, even if their subjects weren't quite ready for their close-up. Chapter 6. Nightlight. 3 nights had passed since the encounter on the 3rd floor, and Maya still hadn't seen Alexandra. The Monteleone's renovation continued without him, though she noticed how the construction crew carefully avoided certain areas, as if the hotel's preferences were being communicated through more subtle channels. She'd taken to walking the perimeter of the hotel at night, her Rolleiflex hanging ready around her neck. The vintage camera felt more reliable in this twilight world she'd stumbled into, its mechanical certainty a comfort when digital sensors failed to capture the strange shifts in light and shadow that seemed to follow her. Tonight, the hotel's presence felt different, more insistent somehow. Doors would crack open as she passed, the brass handles warming invitingly. Windows would unlock themselves with gentle clicks, and even the wrought iron gate seemed to lean toward her, as if urging her to step inside. The golden-veined rose, still impossibly fresh, sat in her camera bag like a compass. She'd noticed it tended to warm slightly when she faced the hotel, its petals shifting as if caught in a breeze, even within its protective wrapping. A cat watched her from one of the hotel's balconies, its eyes reflecting light in ways that made Maya think of Alexandra. When she raised the Rolleiflex, the viewfinder showed her something else entirely, a figure in dated formal wear, raising a glass in silent toast before melting back into shadow. Maya lowered the camera slowly.
I know you're watching,
she said to the empty street.
If you're trying to scare me away, you should know I'm getting rather used to impossible things.
Something moved in her peripheral vision, too quick to catch, too deliberate to be natural. But the quality of movement felt wrong, lacking Alexandra's liquid grace. The rose in her bag turned cold. The hotel's response was immediate and urgent. Every door along the front facade swung open, light spilling onto the sidewalk like a golden carpet. The gate actually creaked forward, its ironwork twisting into an almost beckoning gesture. But before Maya could step toward that offered sanctuary, a sound caught her attention, something that might have been a cry for help, coming from the narrow street behind the hotel. She hesitated, one foot on the bottom step. The hotel's agitation increased, its doors opening wider, lights blazing brighter. But the cry came again, more desperate this time.
I'll just check.
Maya murmured to the anxious building.
2 minutes.
She stepped away from the hotel's protective glow, following the sound into the shadows of the side street. The moment she turned the corner, she knew she'd made a mistake. The hotel's warm light was cut off as if by a knife, and the gas lamps began to flicker and dim, as if the night itself was drawing closer. Maya turned back, but the way she'd come was now shrouded in shadow, the lamps extinguished completely. She could still sense the hotel's frantic energy, but it felt muffled now, distant, as if something was deliberately blocking its reach. Every door she passed was firmly shut, their brass knockers gleaming dully like watching eyes. The sound that had lured her here had stopped, replaced by footsteps, too measured, too purposeful. They matched her pace exactly, staying just far enough back to remain unseen. Instead of running, she did what she did best. She raised her camera, pretending to frame a shot of the architecture while actually using the viewfinder's waist-level angle to look behind her. What she saw made her blood run cold. A figure stood in the middle of the street, barely visible in the dying lamplight. Their outline seemed wrong somehow, too angular, too rigid compared to Alexandra's liquid grace. And they were holding something that could only be a weapon, its metal surface drinking in what little light remained. Maya took a careful step backward, then another. The figure matched her movements exactly, maintaining their distance with mechanical precision. When she reached for her phone, she found it dead despite being fully charged moments ago. A voice cut through the darkness, clinical and cold as a surgeon's blade.
Don't run, little thrall. It will only make this messier than it needs to be.
The word thrall hit Maya like a physical blow, carrying implications she was only beginning to understand. She opened her mouth to explain that she wasn't whatever they thought she was. The night exploded into sound and fury, the crack of gunfire echoing off ancient walls as Maya dove for cover. Something whizzed past her head, leaving a trail of silver light in its wake. She could feel the hotel's desperate attempt to help, but its power couldn't reach this far into the shadows. Maya scrambled behind a corner, her photographer's eye absurdly noting how the attacker's shadow stretched impossibly long against the buildings, cast by light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once.
Enough games.
The voice said, closer now.
Your master can't protect you forever. Better to end this quickly.
Maya gripped her camera like a shield, the rose in her bag burning with cold fire against her side. The hotel's presence pushed against whatever barrier held it back, trying to reach her, but she'd let herself be drawn too far from its sanctuary. The shadow on the wall raised its weapon again, and Maya realized with sudden clarity that she'd run out of both time and options. The last thing she saw before the night turned silver was a familiar figure dropping from above, moving too fast to track, radiating that impossible fever warmth she'd grown to crave. Then everything exploded into chaos. The world became a blur of motion and heat. Maya felt herself swept up in Alexandra's arms, his fever warmth wrapping around her like a shield, as silver bullets traced lethal patterns through the space she'd occupied seconds before. The hunter's clinical voice turned harsh with frustration, but the words were lost in the rush of movement as Alexandra carried her across impossible distances with inhuman speed. When everything stilled, they were back inside the Monteleone. The hotel's presence surged around them, doors slamming shut with decisive finality, locks engaging with a symphony of clicks. Maya felt the building's relief wash over her like a mother fussing over a child who'd wandered too far.
Are you hurt?
Alexandra set her down but didn't step back, his hands running over her shoulders, her arms checking for injuries. The careful distance he'd maintained since the third floor was gone, replaced by an almost desperate need to verify her safety.
I'm fine,
Maya managed, though her voice shook slightly.
but you're not.
Silver light traced through a tear in his sleeve, the wound beneath glowing like molten metal. Alexandra dismissed it with a gesture.
It will heal, though these particular bullets are inconvenient.
Silver?
Maya reached for his arm, but he caught her hand before she could touch the wound.
Among other things,
His fingers lingered on her wrist, as if checking her pulse.
the hunters have had centuries to perfect their methods.
The hotel's lights dimmed slightly, creating a more intimate atmosphere, as Alexandra guided Maya to a settee that definitely hadn't been in the lobby earlier. The fabric looked ancient, but felt perfectly preserved, and Maya had a sudden suspicion about which floor it might have come from.
The hunter called me a thrall.
She said as Alexandra paced before her, his movements tightly controlled.
And you're bleeding silver. I think I deserve some explanations.
He stopped pacing, running a hand through his hair in an unexpectedly human gesture.
Yes, though I'd hoped to spare you this particular reality for a while longer.
His eyes met hers, centuries of weight in his gaze.
The world you've stumbled into is complicated, politically delicate,
Because of the hunters?
because of an uneasy peace.
Alexandra resumed pacing, the wound in his arm still gleaming.
There was a war, you see. A very long one. But then humans invented weapons that could level the playing field. Guns that could fire silver with mechanical precision. Rounds blessed by methods we'd never anticipated. The hunters gained an advantage we couldn't counter, not without adapting in ways that would have made us truly monstrous.
So you made peace instead?
His smile held no humour.
We made rules, territories, agreements about hunting grounds and proper feeding methods, but not before.
He broke off, something ancient and pained crossing his features.
The war nearly destroyed us both, hunters and vampires alike. When humans developed weapons that could fire silver with mechanical precision, the ancients refused to adapt. Pride, you see. They'd lived for millennia, seen empires rise and fall. They couldn't conceive of mere mortals threatening their existence.
He stood, moving to the window, his reflection absent in the glass.
I watched them fall, one by one. Vampires who had walked with kings, who had shaped history from the shadows, reduced to ash by bullets they never saw coming. The hunters were methodical, ruthless. They'd studied us for centuries, learning our weaknesses, our habits. And the ancients, in their arrogance, kept to their old ways until it was too late.
Alexandra's hand traced patterns on the window, frost forming beneath his fingers.
Those of us who survived, we were the younger ones, the ones willing to change. We learned to use modern weapons to adapt our feeding habits. Blood banks, willing donors, synthetic alternatives. We built networks, established diplomatic channels, found ways to exist in your world without preying on it.
His eyes met Maya's in the glass.
But the cost, entire bloodlines were erased. Knowledge accumulated over millennia, lost forever. And the hunters paid dearly too. For every ancient they brought down, dozens of their own perished. Entire families dedicated to the hunt, wiped out in a single night's battle.
That's why both sides agreed to peace?
We had no choice. We were destroying each other, and for what? Pride? Territory? The hunters realized they couldn't eliminate us entirely, not without sacrificing more than they could bear to lose. And we, well, those of us who remained understood that survival meant evolution. So we made rules, drew lines that neither side could cross without consequences.
And the hotel?
Maya glanced at the walls around them.
Where does it fit in?
Neutral ground.
Alexandra's expression softened as he looked up at the ceiling.
Places like the Monteleone are sanctuaries, protected by laws older than the peace itself. No hunter can spill blood here without severe consequences.
Which is why it was trying so hard to get me inside.
Maya remembered the hotel's increasingly desperate attempts to beckon her to safety.
Yes,
Alexandra finally stopped pacing, sinking onto the settee beside her. The proximity sent shivers across her skin despite everything.
the hotel has grown protective of you, as have I, though I've tried very hard not to be.
How's that working out?
Maya asked softly. He laughed, the sound surprised out of him.
About as well as my attempts to stay away.
His hand found hers, fingers intertwining with careful deliberation.
Which is why you need to stay here, at least until we're certain the hunters understand you're not what they think you are.
Here, but my apartment, my things.
I've already been moved to a suite upstairs.
At her raised eyebrow, he added,
The hotel took the liberty. It's been planning this for days, apparently. Rather presumptuous of it, though I can't say I disagree with the precaution.
Maya thought about protesting this high-handed arrangement, but something in Alexandra's expression stopped her. Beneath his careful composure, she could see genuine fear, not of the hunters, but of losing her.
Show me?
She requested instead. The suite turned out to be on the 4th floor, as far from the 3rd floor's embarrassing memories as possible, while still maintaining suitable grandeur. Maya stepped through the doors and caught her breath. The space was larger than her entire apartment, decorated in a seamless blend of historic elegance and modern comfort. Her clothes had been meticulously arranged in a walk-in closet that could have housed a small photography studio. Her equipment sat carefully organised on antique tables that somehow perfectly suited their modern functions.
The hotel has excellent taste.
She managed, running her fingers along a velvet chaise that probably cost more than her car.
The hotel
Alexandre said carefully.
has excellent instincts about what matters.
Maya turned to find him watching her with that intensity that made her forget to breathe. The silver trace in his wound had faded, but she noticed how he held that arm slightly away from his body, protecting it from contact.
Let me help with that.
She said, gesturing to his injury.
Maya!
You can maintain your noble distance tomorrow.
She stepped closer, noting how he simultaneously leaned toward and away from her, like a flower caught between sun and shade.
But right now, you're hurt because of me, and I'm tired of watching you fight whatever this is between us.
It's not that simple.
But he didn't move away when she reached for his arm.
It never is.
Maya carefully rolled up his torn sleeve, revealing the silver-traced wound beneath.
But maybe it doesn't have to be as complicated as you're making it.
His skin burned against her fingers, fever-warm and electric. When she glanced up, she found him watching her with an expression that suggested he was losing a battle with himself.
The hunters won't be the only ones who object.
He said softly.
There are factions among my kind who consider any connection with humans to be beneath us, who would see you as a weakness to be exploited.
Good thing I'll be staying in a supernaturally protected hotel then.
Maya smiled slightly.
With a vampire who apparently can't help being protective, no matter how hard he tries not to be.
The silver traces had finally faded from Alexandra's wound, though Maya noticed he still held himself carefully, like someone testing the edges of healing pain. She hadn't moved from his side while he'd explained more about the supernatural world's delicate politics, and somehow during the conversation, the careful space he usually maintained between them had dissolved entirely. It wasn't until he stood, reluctantly announcing he needed to report the hunter's breach of territory, that Maya realised what felt different. The hollow ache she'd carried since Jason, no, if she was honest, since long before that, had quieted to nothing in Alexandra's presence. Like a chronic pain suddenly lifted, its absence more noticeable than the original hurt. The moment he stepped away, it returned with shocking intensity. Not the old, familiar emptiness, but something sharper, more specific, an Alexandra-shaped void in the world around her.
I need to make a formal report to the Covenant.
Alexandra said, his expression growing more serious.
A hunter attacking this close to sanctuary grounds. It violates several terms of the peace. The council will need to be informed. Diplomatic channels opened with the hunter's leadership.
He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Maya was beginning to recognize as frustration.
Politics. Always politics.
The covenant is?
Maya prompted.
Our governing body, of sorts. They maintain the peace, enforce our laws, negotiate with the hunters when
He glanced at his healing arm.
incidents like this occur. They won't be pleased about a hunter targeting someone under my protection.
Under your protection?
Maya raised an eyebrow.
Is that what I am?
Something flickered in his expression, possession warring with restraint.
What you are, Maya Richardson, defies easy classification, which is precisely why I need to handle this carefully.
He moved closer, close enough that she could feel his fever warmth radiating between them.
I'll return before dawn.
He promised, his hand hovering near her cheek without quite touching.
The hotel will keep you safe until then.
The hotel seems to have opinions about keeping me more than just safe.
Maya said, glancing meaningfully around the luxurious suite. Alexandra's lips twitched.
Yes, well, it's developed rather dramatic tendencies over the centuries. Though in this case...
His eyes met hers, midnight dark and full of things he wouldn't say.
In this case, I find myself in complete agreement with its choices.
He moved to the door with that liquid grace she'd grown to recognize, then paused.
Maya.
Her name on his lips felt like a photograph being developed, meaning slowly emerging from chaos.
Promise me you'll stay within the hotel's boundaries.
I promise.
She managed a small smile.
I think the hotel would drag me back by my ankles if I tried to leave anyway.
A warm draft ruffled her hair in obvious agreement. Alexandra's expression softened as he watched the building's interaction with her.
It seems I'm not the only one who finds it impossible to maintain proper distance where you're concerned.
Then he was gone, leaving Maya alone with an sentient hotel and the echoing absence of his fever warmth. She lasted approximately 10 minutes before the photographer in her demanded exploration. The suite was stunning, yes, but she could feel the hotel's barely contained excitement, like a friend desperate to give a house tour.
All right,
she said to the empty room.
Show me what you want me to see.
The lights dimmed in the suite while brightening in the hallway, creating an obvious path. Maya followed, her bare feet silent on plush carpets that definitely hadn't been there during yesterday's renovation work. The hotel's presence wrapped around her like a companion's arm linked through hers, eager but also oddly shy, as if worried about presuming too much familiarity. They wandered through corridors that seemed to shift and reform, showing her glimpses of the hotel's many faces. Here was the glamour of the roaring 20s. There the subdued elegance of the Victorian era. Some passages felt older, holding memories of New Orleans' earliest days. Others showed her possible futures, modern luxury seamlessly blended with historical charm. The third floor remained firmly off limits, its doors now sealed with intricate brass locks that Maya suspected even Alexandra's key couldn't open. But other secrets revealed themselves freely. Hidden reading nooks, forgotten ballrooms, winter gardens that somehow thrived despite being indoor spaces. In one such garden, Maya found a collection of photographs dating back to the earliest days of the medium. They lined the walls in elegant frames, each capturing the hotel at different moments in its long life. She noticed that certain figures appeared repeatedly in the backgrounds, always slightly out of focus, always turned just enough to maintain plausible deniability about their identities.
He's been watching over you for a long time, hasn't he?
She asked the hotel, studying an image from what appeared to be the 1850s. A familiar silhouette stood in shadow beside a gas lamp, his stance protective even then. The hotel's presence warmed with pleasure at her observation. A door Maya hadn't noticed swung open, revealing a small study that somehow managed to be both cosy and grand. An antique desk dominated one wall, its surface covered with leather-bound ledgers. But it was the photographs on the desk that caught her attention. Modern ones, clearly taken with digital cameras. They showed her, dozens of shots from the past week, capturing her at work around the hotel. Her professional eye recognized them as test shots, the kind automatically saved when checking lighting and angles. But seeing them displayed here, carefully arranged among the hotel's treasured memories,
You've been watching me too.
she realized, touching one of the frames. The hotel's shy pleasure wrapped around her like a warm blanket. A clock somewhere struck 3, its chimes carrying a different quality than the quarter's usual bells. Maya felt Alexandra's absence pulse through her like a physical ache, stronger now that she understood what it meant. The hotel's response was immediate. The study's chairs rearranged themselves invitingly, and a tea service appeared on a side table. Actual proper tea, she noticed, not the hotel restaurant's usual offerings. The message was clear. Make yourself at home, settle in, let us take care of you while you wait. Maya sank into one of the chairs, accepting the hotel's hospitality with a smile.
I don't suppose you have any more photographs you'd like to show me? Maybe ones featuring a certain historical consultant through the ages?
The hotel's answering ripple of amusement felt almost conspiratorial. A drawer in the desk slid open, revealing a collection of daguerreotypes that definitely weren't part of the official archives.
I'll take that as a yes.
Maya curled up with her tea, preparing to learn more about the vampire who couldn't quite manage to stay away from her.
Though I have a feeling Alexandra wouldn't entirely approve of you sharing these.
The lights dimmed to a more intimate level, and Maya could have sworn she felt the hotel's equivalent of a wink. Clearly, she wasn't the only one who thought some rules were made to be broken. As she settled in to examine the photographs, Maya realized the ache of Alexandra's absence had softened slightly. Not gone. Nothing could quite fill the space he'd carved out in her world, but gentler now, cushioned by the hotel's affectionate presence and the promise of dawn.